Today we're going to talk about the providential hand of God. Do you know what providence means? Providence, when we talk about God, means that God carefully directs the events of history to fulfill his plans. Many good things happen in this world. Many bad things happen in this world. And amid the good and the bad, God is working out a plan that fulfills his purpose. One of the best illustrations I've recently heard of the providential hand of God is that it is likened to a cruise ship. When people go on a cruise, they're on vacation, and they enjoy the freedom to make all kinds of choices. They can decide when to eat, when to sleep, when to relax, when to play. The people on a cruise enjoy their freedom. Yet, there's one thing those passengers cannot control: the ship's destination. While on board, they're making their own choices. However, at the same time, there's a captain of that ship who is directing its course and destination. So it is with the providential hand of God and the people on this earth. During our lifetime, we get to enjoy the freedom of making our own decisions, and yet, behind the scenes, there is a sovereign God who is providentially directing the course and the destination of our lives. In other words, God has a path for us, and he has a path for this world in which he's the captain, and he will bring the events of this world to the destination of his choosing. But you might be inclined to look at this world and realize it is a very dark place. And you could wonder, how could God's hand really be at work? Our world is dark. There are evil things taking place. Sinful decisions are made. People are selfish, people are sensual, people are rebellious, they're murderous, they're godless. And we might start to wonder, is God really at work in such a dark world? The answer, yes. I am confident that God is still at work even when the world seems so dark. How can I be assured of that? A place like Esther chapter 2. Esther 2 is a story about the dark ways of the world. It's about a prideful, selfish king who refused to admit when he was wrong. It's a story about women who were pampered at first and yet ended up being used and abused. It's a story about immoral activity. And it's a story that includes servants of the king attempting to commit treason. This is a story that includes the dark ways of the world in which we live. And yet, amid all the darkness, it is also a story about the providential hand of God at work. If there is a lesson that we can learn from Esther chapter 2, I believe it would be this: the dark ways of the world cannot escape the sovereign, or I should say providential, hand of God. The dark ways of the world cannot escape the providential hand of God. And for those of us who belong to God, for those of us who are God's people, I believe that is something we can take great comfort in. It's a reassuring reality to know that no matter how dark our world becomes around us, it will never escape the providential hand of God. Now the question becomes, how does this chapter show us that? Well, in this chapter, a sequence of 6 events reveal that the dark ways of the world do not escape the hand of God. 6 events, and they are pointing to the providence of God. And I want to show them to you this morning, beginning with event number 1, the king was lonely. In verses 1 through 4, we discover a lonely king in the aftermath of a series of poor decisions. He comes to his senses, but in his pride, he refuses to admit he was wrong, and instead he takes the advice of some yes men who were really just trying to flatter him to secure their own status. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. To understand what is happening, we need to remember what took place in chapter 1. In chapter 1, the king held this lavish party, and at the end of the festivities, he commanded his wife to parade herself in front of all of his guests so that they could gawk at her and lust after her. But she refused. And her refusal made King Ahasuerus furious. He was so enraged that he stripped her of her title of queen, declaring that she could never see him again, and a new queen was to replace her. Well, eventually, the king sobered up. He came to his senses, and verse 1 states that after his anger subsided, he remembered Vashti. In other words, he realized he messed up. He was drunk, he lost his temper, he took bad advice, and he made a bad choice. And now he's living with the consequences. I think there's a principle we can all glean from that. Wise people consider the consequences of their decisions before making them. We need to learn from other people's mistakes. In this case, we should learn from King Ahasuerus' mistake. He's an example of what not to do. But the king refused to acknowledge his poor choice. He would not really admit that he was wrong. And so a new plan was implemented. His men came up with an idea. Let's have a beauty pageant. Let's gather every beautiful virgin girl from the entire kingdom. Let's make them part of the king's harem. Let's allow them to put on their makeup, and may the most beautiful girl win. Now, this sounds glamorous. Sounds fun. A competition of looks to become the queen. I can imagine the advertisements. Lonely king looking for love. Perhaps you could be the lucky one, you know? Imagine the palace, your home, the maidservants there for you. Doesn't it sound nice? Yet, there is one word that we read that should be a red flag to us. Did you see it? It's the word harem. It refers to the holding place for the concubines of the king. In other words, to be queen, you had to first become a concubine. A concubine was a woman who lives with a man but has a lower status than his wife. And in this case, for King Ahasuerus, his concubines probably served no other purpose than for his own pleasure. So to be queen, you had to first become that. And if you weren't chosen to be queen, you'd remain a concubine. But if you happened to be chosen as queen, you would soon realize that you have to share your husband with every other beautiful woman in Persia. When you really think about it, the glamour of it all fades fast. And to make matters worse, there was another red flag. Notice it wasn't voluntary. The officers did not invite the beautiful virgins. They were all to gather them. If you feel like that. It was not an option. The promise was, come, enjoy happiness. But it wasn't so happy. They were forced into this. This was not an option. The young girls were taken from their parents by force. And once they belonged to the king, they lost their freedom. I think we're starting to see how dark the ways of the world can be. And you might wonder, did this actually happen? Well, yeah. These events occurred around 480 BC, and King Ahasuerus is better known in the secular world as King Xerxes. These events did happen. The ways of our world can be dark, but we need to keep reading, because as we'll see, they never escaped the providential hand of God. God was working out his plan through some wild events. Event number 1, the king was lonely. But now that brings us to event number 2. The virgins were drafted. In verses 5 through 11, we are introduced to a man named Mordecai. He's a Jew. He's not a perfect man, and he does not necessarily serve as the best example for godliness. We don't hear about him praying 3 times a day like Daniel. We don't hear about him going to Jerusalem with Zerubbabel. In some respects, his walk with God is average. However, we do discover that he was a man of faith and that God did use him despite his imperfections. That's a valuable and encouraging lesson for us to learn, as none of us are perfect, yet God can still use us. And we're going to find that Mordecai does have some really good qualities about him. We're going to point that out as we go along. But right now we're introduced to him. And we're also introduced to his younger cousin. Her name was Esther. Esther's parents had both died, and her cousin Mordecai, who was older than her, raised her as his own daughter. How about I just read it to you? Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and edict were proclaimed, and when the many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Hegai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now this is where we start to get a glimpse of God's providence at work. Why was Mordecai in Susa? Because a long time ago, his great-grandfather was taken from Jerusalem and relocated by the Babylonian armies, and Mordecai happened to be born in that area. He did not choose where he was born. He did not choose to whom he was born. It was God who decided that. The same is true for Esther. God ordained the days of her life. She was born at a certain time in a certain place. Her parents had both passed away. That was out of her control, but it did not escape the hand of God. And as we'll see, God used Mordecai and Esther. He placed both of them in the right place at the right time to be instruments in his hands to accomplish his purposes for his people in his glory. I don't want us reading this book of Esther without realizing the real hero of the story is God. This is a story about God using his people for his glory. But we're reminded as well in verse 8 of the dark ways of the world. Many young women were gathered, and Esther was taken as well. Esther did not volunteer for this. Mordecai did not recommend that she enter the contest. I believe Mordecai gets a bad rap sometimes because people think Mordecai persuaded Esther to do this. But that's not what the text says. It indicates she was taken. She was forced into this against her will, just like many other young women. The virgins were drafted. And then we ask, can God really be at work in a world like that, where the king is selfishly rallying hundreds, if not thousands, of beautiful virgins all for himself? The answer is yes. No matter how dark this world gets, it never escapes the providence of God. Because by the providence of God, Esther happened to be beautiful, both in figure and in face. There's a song by the Monks written in 1979, the chorus, it basically goes, "Nice legs, shame about the face." Have you ever heard that song? Well, Esther, they wouldn't be singing that about her. She had the legs, she also had the face. But there was more to that than just her looks. She was beautiful as well on the inside. When she was taken into custody, there was a eunuch named Haggai who looked after the girls. And of all the girls, Esther stood out. She won the favor of Haggai. He saw something different in her. And so he treated her well. And Lord willing, I'm going to point this out later, Esther was a woman who had some really great qualities about her. At the same time, she did have some compromising situations in her life. But before we give her all the credit for how everything played out, let's not forget, this is a story about God's hand at work. Because the question is, who made her beautiful? Who caused her to be born when she was born? Who gave her the personality that she had? Who caused her to win the favor of Haggai? It was all God, his hand at work in her life. If in your workplace or in your spheres of influence, if you have found that you have won favor or you've won the respect of people around you, don't give yourself all the credit. Give the credit to God. He's the one that made you who you are, put you where you are, put the people around you that are around you. Now in verses 10 and 11, we discover that Esther was keeping her nationality a secret. That was by Mordecai's recommendation. And then meanwhile, Mordecai was pacing back and forth every day, worried sick about her. It's hard to know what to make of those verses. Some people suggest that Esther was keeping her mouth shut because she was afraid to be bold, to be a bold witness for the Lord. And Mordecai was possibly pacing back and forth because he wasn't really living in the will of God. They say he should have been back in Jerusalem at this point. But because he was still in Susa, he was out of the will of God, and now he's stressed out. That's what some people say. I think those conclusions are pretty harsh. I see this, and I'm just thinking that they did the best they could with what they had. They were trying to be wise. And Mordecai's pacing, more than anything, it just demonstrates his love and his care for Esther. One thing I can appreciate about these verses is that they describe real life. Because we all go through stressful times in life where we don't know what to say or what to do. But if this chapter has something to encourage us when we go through stressful times, it's that God is sovereign and he never stops working out his plan. So hang in there, keep going, even when the world around you is dark and you don't know what to do. Let's move on now to event number 3. The women were used. In verses 12 through 14, we read about the experiences of the young women. And I probably can't call them virgins anymore because the writer no longer refers to them as such. I think that indicates the truth of what was really happening. Let me read it to you. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go in to King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young women went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shahagaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. And she would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. These women were given wonderful treatment at first. They had 1 year to prepare themselves for a visit with the king. They received perfumes and ointments. They had a year to get their skin as smooth as possible, a year to let their hair grow to just the right length. They were given a year to transform their looks to be the best they could possibly be. And when it was their turn, she would see the king, and she would get to call the shots on what she would bring with her. It sounds nice. They got pampered. But in verse 14, we learn the ugly truth of it all. They would go into the king for one night, and in the morning they would return to be with the other concubines. And we can imagine what would take place overnight. And when the night was over, she'd leave with the possibility that the king would not even remember her name. This represents the darker side of the world. Women are often persuaded to make compromises. Initially, the promise is for satisfaction or for popularity or for money or maybe even for love. And in the end, they feel used and unloved. Yet even in these bleak situations, we can learn God is still at work. You know, sometimes it's only after people have truly crossed the line that they realize the world's ways didn't satisfy. And with that realization, that draws them to God. God takes what the world means for evil and he turns it into good. Now let's look at event number 4. The queen was selected. In verses 15 through 18, what happens for Esther can only be described by the providential hand of God. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Esther was not only beautiful, but she was also a woman of good character, and she was smart. She was wise. She knew that Haggai, probably out of anybody, knew better what the king liked and didn't like. And so instead of coming up with her own ideas, she simply asked Haggai for advice about what she should request, and she took nothing but what he advised. Seeking out advice from those who've been through things before you is a wise move. That's what Esther did. when you find yourself in stressful situations, don't be afraid to ask for advice. Esther's turn to visit the king had arrived in the 7th year of King's reign. That means it had been 4 years since chapter 1. No doubt the king had seen hundreds of different girls by this point. But Esther beat the odds. He was attracted to Esther above all the other women. She won grace and favor in his sight, and she was made queen. Now we've got to ask, what was it about Esther? It was the sovereignty of God, who shaped her into the person she was, placed her in her circumstances, granted her grace and favor with others. That's what was up with Esther. It was God working in her life, opening doors for her so that she could just simply be an instrument in the hand of God. When things go your way in life, never forget there is a sovereign God who allows those events to happen for you. And the way to make the most of it is to consider yourself an instrument in the hand of God, ready and willing to serve him with the opportunities that he brings your way. The Bible says, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do all to the glory of God. In verse 18, the king was so happy to have finally found his new queen that he did what he was known for. He partied. He threw another party, and as a party favor for the people, he gave them a break in the taxes, and then he offered gifts with generosity. And I would imagine that this moment was very wonderful for Esther. She was probably pretty happy. The king was happy, and the people were happy too. Now here's what's interesting though. Esther had been forced into a compromising situation. See, as a Jew, she was not to marry a foreigner, much less a foreign king. And as a woman of God, she was not to engage in sexual immorality as an unmarried woman, and yet she was brought into that situation. And now, here she is, being elevated to a position that only God could have orchestrated. Here's what we learn. Those who belong to God, God always cares for them, even when they aren't necessarily living life according to his will or his word. I can think of times in my own life when I was not thinking about God, I was not in his word, I was not praying about my decisions in life, and yet, as I look back on things, the various doors that were open for me were still under the providential hand of God. He was looking out for me even when I was not walking close to him. But that's what he does. He cares for his own, even when his own have strayed from him. If you have believed in Jesus to save you, you can always know, no matter what, God cares for you. Even when you find yourself brought into the dark ways of the world. Now that brings us to event number 5. The plot was exposed. In verse 18, Esther felt on top of the world, and everything seemed perfect. But in verses 19 through 22, we learn that getting promoted doesn't solve all problems in life. Verse 19 opens this way. Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time. Unfortunately, Esther's promotion did not curb the king's lustful behavior. He chose to gather even more virgins. And I believe there's a lesson here for us to learn, especially for men struggling with lust and for women considering marrying a man who is steeped in sin. The lesson is, marriage does not eliminate temptation. Many people believe, if I just get married, everything will resolve itself. But the reality is, temptations still persist, even after you get married. And for any young woman that is thinking about marriage and thinking that it will magically erase the lust in a man's mind, Esther will tell you that's not the case. The only way to truly overcome sin is to personally deal with it between you and the Lord. So verse 19 opens up with kind of a discouraging reality for Esther. The promotion did not make her problems go away. But then at the end of verse 19, the writer switches back to what was going on for Mordecai. Not only had Esther been promoted, but evidently Mordecai had been promoted as well. Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. That's usually a phrase in the Bible that refers to a person in a position of authority, a person who can make judgments for others. Now, verse 20. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. Life is full of ups and downs, highs and lows. When we last saw Mordecai, he was pacing back and forth in a low place of life. Now we see him again. He's in a different season. He's seated at the king's gate. Meanwhile, Esther has also faced some ups and downs throughout life, and she kind of remains in a difficult situation because she has to continue to keep her identity as a Jewish woman concealed. If her heritage were discovered, she might lose her position as queen because the Jews were not very well respected by the people of Susa. So both of them were going through various highs and lows in life, but amid it all, God gave them a new opportunity. Mordecai discovers a plot that two disgruntled eunuchs were discussing to kill the king. And the question is, how did Mordecai find out? By the providential hand of God. And what we can appreciate about Mordecai and Esther here is they don't keep silent. They discover the information that needed to be exposed, and they did the right thing. They exposed the wrongdoing, and as we'll see later, God took note of what they did. They did the right thing, and God was going to honor them later for their boldness. But wow, what a story so far. We've seen a lot. What a sequence of events of this dark world. We began with a lonely king making prideful decisions, but God is working in the events as they transpire. God put the people of his choice in the right place at the right time, all to fulfill his plan. We are learning that God works even when the world is dark. But there's one more event that we want to look at. Event number 6, the deed was recorded. In verse 23, when the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. The king does his research. The plot is discovered to be true. The king's life is saved, and the men were sentenced to death. But at the very end of verse 23, we read about something that's going to become very important for how this whole story plays out later in chapter 6. It was recorded in the book of the Chronicles. The good deed of Mordecai, exposing the truth, saving the king's life, was put down in writing. And that event, once again, little did anybody know at the time, was all part of God's providential hand of guidance. The dark ways of the world cannot escape the providential hand of God. Now, as we bring this chapter to a close today, here's what I want to do. First of all, I want to briefly mention some commendable qualities of both Esther and Mordecai. Neither of them were perfect, but I couldn't help but notice these qualities. I wanted to bring them up today because I think we Christians ought to take note of them. In Esther, I saw 5 commendable qualities. Number 1, Esther was a quiet, humble, obedient woman. She was the kind of person that was quick to listen, slow to speak. Number 2, she was wise and listened to advice. Number 3, she was obedient to her authority figures. Number 4, she was not changed by fame. Even after she was promoted queen, she remained humble. And number 5, she was willing to expose evil. That's what I see in Esther. Now in Mordecai, I see 3 commendable qualities. Number 1, he cared for more than just himself. He looked out for Esther. Number 2, his concern was for the welfare of the one entrusted to him. He's a good leader. He cared for the people under him. And number 3, he spoke up when he saw evil. Those are some great qualities that I think we Christians really can seek to emulate of Mordecai and Esther. And so that's the first thing I wanted to do. And now secondly, I just want to leave us with 4 thoughts of application. Number 1, our decisions in life have consequences. Consider the implications of your decisions before you make them. Learn from King Ahasuerus' bad example. Number 2, when things go well for you, don't let it get to your head. Remember, it's God who permitted it to happen. Number 3, when things do not go well for you, remember, God is working out a plan that is bigger and better for his glory. And number 4, even though none of us are perfect, God always watches over his own children. And the question is, are you his child? How do you become his child? You put your faith in his Son, Jesus Christ, believing Jesus is Lord. He died for my sins. He rose from the dead. Those who believe in him become the children of God. May you place your faith in Jesus today and become God's child. Let's pray. Father, we look at a text like this and we say, wow, our world has some crazy things that happen in it, but thank you for your providence. I pray that knowing these realities of your providence would bring us all closer to a deeper trust in you. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.